Thousands were murdered, injured, and scarred for life. What you're about to hear was not taught in our history classes, but it was a dark, dark time in Nigeria's history. And this was before the Civil War. Why it was not taught, I'll let you be the judge for that. Welcome to Banter with Oye. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. It's Banter with Oye. And today we'll be getting into the final episode of our discussions about Nigeria's military coup era. It is based off the book Oil, Politics and Violence by Max Cillian. You should get the book. I'm telling you, you should get the book. Now, this part of the story is the most heartbreaking. It's really sad and it's very triggering. So I must warn you as we're getting into the discussions that you should prepare your mind. And if you are not strong enough to listen to something like this, I would tell you to stop the video now, because this part of the story is really, really triggering, and it's really triggering. Basically, this part of the story happened before the Civil War, which is popularly called the Biafra War. Between the first coup and Biafra War or the Civil War, what happened? How did we get there? The most popular part of the story is the disagreement between General Ojukwu and General Gowon, and then subsequently the Civil War. However, we'll be going into the details of the July coup, which is one of the bloodiest coup in Nigeria's history. After the first coup, Southerners were very happy that the military was now in politics. By Southerners, we're looking at the East and the West. Now, the reason why they were happy was because they felt like Northerners would no longer have control over the decisions that affected them in the South. Now, Aburi came into the government introducing himself as a corrective government to correct the mistakes and issues of the previous governments. As a result, he started arresting politicians from the opposing party, particularly NNDP. Those are Chief Akitola's people. But he did not arrest politicians from the MPC, which is the Northern People's Congress, because he felt like they were the most impacted by the first coup, which people would say was a mistake on his part. And we will get to that soon. One of the first things Agui did was to announce the Unification Decree in May of 1966, and this was controversial. One of the first things he did was he changed Nigeria from having regions to groups of provinces. It changed from Federal Republic of Nigeria to the Republic of Nigeria. And then to eliminate tribalism, he eliminated he eliminated political parties, and then abolished tribal groups. And at the time, the Igbo State Union was the largest, and he eliminated that. And the most controversial was unifying the civil services. Now, prior to this, Ahmadu Bello had an northernization program which allowed every region have their own civil services. Now, unifying the civil services to the northerners was a threat to them, because they felt like, particularly the Igbos, were more experienced, they were more outgoing, they were more educated than they were. So they were threatened, and they did not like this. However, to the Southerners thought that this unification announcement was very trivial, like regions to group of provinces, Federal Republic of Nigeria to the Republic of Nigeria. It was child's play. Agoye was not going to win. In response to the Unification Decree, the North broke out into riots, attacking their Igbo neighbors. There was murder, there was arson, there was looting. It was a complete mess in the North. Now, at this point, the North was now in their hostile era. They were asking questions like, why was it that there was no Igbo politician that had been murdered during the January coups, during the first coup? Why was it that only one Igbo soldier was murdered? How did it become that Agui survived, and then how did he become the head of state? And then why was it mostly northern politicians that were the victims of the coup? Some thought that this was mere coincidences, while others felt like Agui becoming the head of state validated their concerns and opinions that this was truly an Igbo propaganda and an Igbo coup. At this point, the North was now going back to listen to the speeches of Ahmadu Bello and Tafawa Balewa and then considering them their heroes, forgetting that they did have contempt for these men. All of this led to the North concluding that every Igbo man, woman, whether military or civilian, was an accomplice or was guilty of the January coup. Southerners were not helping matters. In the radio, in the articles, they were pushing out articles that was supporting the actions of the mutineers from the January coup. Northerners did not like that. But the bigger problem was that they did not care which Southerner was pushing out these articles or this narrative. To them, it was an Igbo offense. Now, remember when I told you that Aguiyi did not arrest NPC politicians because he did not want to aggravate the Northerners further. These politicians used the opportunity to create a vengeful state of mind in their people against the Igbos. Northern soldiers, on the other hand, those ones did not care about any civilian leader that died. They didn't care about the demise of Ahmadu Bello or Tafawa Balewa. They were more concerned about the demise of their own military leaders, particularly Brigadier Mai Malari. And as a result, they remained in a mutinous state. They were not taking orders from any Igbo military leader, whether it was their senior or not. They did not care. In short, they voiced out their opinion that they were going to revenge. And they were saying this openly. They didn't care about anything. It also did not help that their politicians, their leaders, their families were, telling them to avenge their people, right? And on top of that, they had their wives that were questioning their masculinity, calling them all sorts of names. You're a coward. You cannot do anything about this. Look at what they did to us. Yakubu Gowon comes and tries to pacify them, but they did not appreciate it. In short, at that point, they started looking at him like he was too involved in Aguiyi's government. Now, before the January coup, the Igbos held 7 out of the 17 most senior positions in the military. Now, after the coup, they held 8. Aguiyi promoted soldiers based on seniority and regions. So the Northerners ended up having more promotions in the military at the time. Now, the Igbos were not happy about it because they felt like Aguiyi was pandering to the North and overcompensating them for their loss in January. To make matters worse, Aguiyi was not explaining to anybody about, the occurrences of the January coup. To him, it felt like, giving this information and telling them the details of what happened would lead to more incitement and it could make things worse. So that created a gap. People were then filling in those gaps themselves, and they were filling them with very, very dangerous rhetorics and falsehoods and fake stories. One of the most popular stories was that the soldiers poured palm wine on Tafawa Balewa, the prime minister, as a sign of disrespect. And in response, the prime minister said that the Igbos will not rule Nigeria for another 25 years. Interestingly, the involvement of the Yorubas and Northerners in the coup, that is the January coup, was not revealed until after 20 years. So an investigation was ongoing about the January coup, and their trial was set for August 1966 before it was postponed till October. This information was not made public. Aguiyi did not make the information public. As a result, the Northern soldiers felt like Aguiyi supported the actions of January coup. In fact, there was nothing Aguiyi could have done that was going to pacify them. To him, he was the head of state that came out on top after the demise of all their own leaders, both civilian and military. So he really couldn't win either way. Northern NCUs planned their own rematch in July, which is probably called the counter coup. Take into consideration that Northern soldiers had the highest number of men in the infantry unit, that is the foot soldiers that go into the war zone. They listed their grievances. 1, the murder of their civilian and military leaders. 2, the soldiers that participated in the coup had still not been tried and they were getting paid in detention. Thirdly, the unification decree. 4th, the rumor that there is another Igbo coup, which they were planning to take out the remaining Northern soldiers. This is not entirely true. The Igbos were planning a coup, but it was to take out Aguiyi because they felt he wasn't a firm leader. 5th, the fact that Aguiyi surrounded himself with Igbo soldiers. This was completely false. In fact, Agoye surrounded himself with mostly northern soldiers to show his loyalty to them. Lastly, Agoye's plan to rotate military governors. This letter was sent to Gowon, and in it they said if Gowon did not take actions to avenge their leaders within a set time, they would take laws into their hands. It is unknown whether Gowon passed this information to his superiors, though senior northern officers were involved in the planning of the coup. The coup was largely carried out by NCOs and lieutenants. Ironically, many of the northern officers that took part in the January coup also played prominent roles in the July coup. According to them, they were misled to take part in the January coup. The unofficial leader of the coup was General Muritala Mohammed, and he did not hide his intentions from his Igbo colleagues. In fact, he was reported to Agoye, but unfortunately there was no evidence to prove this, so Agoye did nothing about it. Most of the planning took place in Ikoyi in the home of Captain Joe Garba. He said that all northern officers that were serving in Abeokuta, Ibadan, Ikeja, and Lagos were involved in the coup one way or another. They even had moles in Agoye's entourage. Remember how I told you that Agoye surrounded himself with northern soldiers to earn their loyalty? The coup was postponed multiple times by General Muritala Mohammed out of fear. But on July 29, 1966, the commanding officer at Abeokuta Garrison, Lieutenant Colonel Gabriel Okurinze, received a tip about a potential coup. He called a meeting and spoke to the soldiers and told them that they should come forward if they have any information about the coup. An Igbo NCO then instructed other soldiers to go around and collect arms, given the tense atmosphere at this point in time. The northern NCOs who were already planning a mutiny took this and interpreted it as the Igbo soldiers wanting to attack them. Instead, they took that opportunity to strike first. They went to the unit armory and instructed the armorer to only give weapons to northern soldiers. Now, they did this while the colonel was still speaking to the soldiers in the meeting. The assault was led by Sergeant Kabo Kwale and Corporal Maje. They both went to the armory, picked up their weapons, and headed for the meeting, where they shot Colonel Gabriel Okurenze and Major John Obienu. After the shooting, all hell broke loose and soldiers were running in different directions. At this point, northern soldiers conducted door-to-door search looking for Igbo soldiers. They mounted roadblocks, and when they found them, they shot them and they put their bodies in a car parked beside the barracks. Some soldiers that did not want to participate in the mutiny were too scared not to participate because they felt like if they did not participate, they would be imprisoned by their fellow soldiers. So they joined in the mutiny. A certain lieutenant was able to escape in the middle of the ruckus, and then he called the Lagos barracks to inform them about what was happening in Abeokuta. Unfortunately, the call was picked by another soldier that was part of the plot for the mutiny, and they took that as a signal to start their mutiny in Lagos. They asked for reinforcement for Lagos and Ibadan. Upon their arrival at Ikeja, they started another round of assault on Igbo soldiers. They went further into the Ikeja airport and they turned it into an execution ground for Igbo soldiers, and they met painful and torturing deaths. Ironically, most of the Igbo officers that were attacked in Lagos were the same officers that did all they could to put down the January coup. We are now in Ibadan, and in Ibadan, 2 dozen non-tied troops under the command of Major T.Y. Danjuma, who is part of Agui's entourage, surrounded the State House, disarmed the guards, and all the northern guards within the State House security joined Major Danjuma's crew, and then they surrounded the State House. Inside the State House, is a very worried and anxious Aguiyi and Colonel Fajiri, as well as Colonel Njoko. While Colonel Njoko was able to escape the commotion, Aguiyi and Fajiri was unable to, and they were led out with their hands tied. And when they got outside, Aguiyi's badge was ripped off, and they were led off property. Now there are varying accounts of who exactly is responsible for the demise of Aguiyi. But what is certain is that Aguiyi and Fajiri were beaten, stripped, and then offed. Now, in Ibadan barracks, the commanding officer had lost control, and the northern soldiers from Abeokuta now joined forces with the northern soldiers in Ibadan, and they rounded up all their Igbo colleagues, locked them up in the guard room, and threw grenades into the guard room. In Lagos, in less than 24 hours since the coup started, northern soldiers had taken over all the military units in Lagos. They were in control of the federal guards, the airports, and the Ikeja cantonment. Brigadier Ogundupe, who is now the most senior military officer, sent troops to go and try and take back the airports. But these troops, who were mostly non-combatant soldiers, were not a match for the very experienced northern troops at the airports, and they were overpowered. In Kaduna, 24 hours after the coup was already in progress, their Igbo commander, Okuru, pled with his troops for loyalty. But they took this as an opportunity to strike, and they offed their commanding officer, rounded up all their Igbo colleagues, and offing them as well. In this battalion is a young General Sonny Abacha. Now, what was more diabolical about the Kaduna region was they would sound the alarm for parades. Now, when all the soldiers come to the parade ground, they would separate the Igbo soldiers from the northern soldiers and load all the Igbo soldiers into a truck where they would then be off. Now, this was done multiple times by northern soldiers. In Kano, there was no immediate assaults because when Gowon called to inform them about the coup, the phone was picked up by the second in command, a Yoruba man, Major James Oluleye, who immediately spoke to the troops, took the keys of the armory, and locked up all the weapons in the armory. As a result, the soldiers couldn't immediately participate in the assault. Or did they? Now, in Enugu, there was a plan to eliminate Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu, but it was prevented by distress calls from Abeokuta. There was a Lieutenant Colonel David Ogunwe who was able to persuade the soldiers to hand over the keys to him, and he also was able to get a truce with the northern soldiers. In Benin, there was no permanent military base. However, Lieutenant Colonel Ejo was able to plead with the soldiers and told them that if they were going to attack anybody, they should attack him first, but leave everyone else unarmed. Brigadier Babafemi Ogudipe was now the most senior surviving military officer, but the situation was beyond his control and capabilities, largely because he was a southerner and he was unable to assert his authority over the northern troops. So he declared a state of emergency over all of the affected areas. Peter Cantonment was the undeclared HQ for the mutineers. Ogundipe sent Gowon to go speak to them. When he got there, he met with the leaders of the coup, and they were Lieutenant Colonel Muritala Mohammed, Majors Martin Adamu, Shitu Alao Musa Osman, and Captain Joe Gaba. And they had their they had their conditions. They had their conditions for a ceasefire. And the first thing was the reparation of Southerners and Northerners to their respective state of origin, and the secession of the North from Nigeria. Basically, the North wants to go out of Nigeria. They no longer wanted to be a part of Nigeria anymore. Now, Ojukwu replied, if that is what they want, let them go, provided the Confederation continues with the leadership of the most senior officer. So a meeting was organized by the head of police, and the goal was to try and persuade the military men from seceding from Nigeria. But Muitala refused and it was very difficult. Now, a justice that was there then told him that, how would you pay your troops? All of the nation's money is in the Central Bank of Nigeria, which at the time was in Lagos. Muitala then responded by going to cordon off the Central Bank of Nigeria. Then they further reminded him that Brigadier Ogundipe is the most senior and he would easily get support from friendly countries to help him attack the northern region. Now, they needed to bring in civil servants into the conversation because this is the second time the country is leaderless in 6 months. Muritala was still very uncompromising. He was still very aggressive. He was just very, very vocal. And again, he was a spokesperson for the mutineers. But it got so bad that he was always interrupting Gowon, who was a senior, to the point where Gowon had to say, no, if you don't let me talk, I will leave this meeting and I will not join this conversation anymore. At that point, Muritala allowed Gowon to speak. Now, the civilians went further and told the mutineers that the North had more to lose if the North should succeed. Now, they said the North would be trapped, landlocked, and cut off from the sea, and as well as would not get any economic benefits from the South. Now, the minority ethnic groups amongst the North were the first to see the light and, accept this compromise. I don't know what the compromise was, but they were the first after the compromise because they realized that, or because they were scared of a dominance of Fulani Hausa leadership in a future northern state if they agreed to it. After they agreed, finally the rest of them came on board with it grudgingly. Grudgingly. The discussion then became, how do we make the country united given the large scale of him that has happened and was still happening. Now, northern soldiers and southern soldiers were not willing to share barracks. And this conversation was taking about 3 days. And while the conversation was going on, northern soldiers were still running mad, leaving bodies in their wake. However, in all of this, northern civilian and military were not interested in the southern-led government. Ojukwu suggested that Brigadier Ogudipe become the leader since he was the most senior. They were not interested. Their only condition to succeed, even though succeeding does not benefit them, is that Northerner becomes the leader, which fell on Gowon. As a result, Ojukwu did not recognize Gowon's leadership. Now, in all of this conversation, which is taking 3 days, these Northern soldiers were still running mad. Now, within 3 days, Igbo soldiers were either fleeing, injured, or demised. Now, in all of this, civilians didn't know what was happening in the barracks. Despite Gowon being the head of state, Muritala was still the power and the voice, or Muritala was still the force behind his throne. And he threatened Gowon and told Gowon that he would march south if Gowon did not stop being soft on Ojukwu. And northern soldiers reiterated the statement that Muritala was saying. Gowon was trying to stabilize his government, but he struggled. And unfortunately, his leadership only intensified the scale of the offing. It got so bad that these soldiers started getting psychologically affected, whereby they were then mutilating bodies and they were addressing themselves with the names and the ranks of the men that they offed. This also got to the point where southern soldiers had no choice but to stop going to work because they were scared, because the offing was so indiscriminate that whether you were in administrative, non-combat, it didn't matter the kind of person that you were. People were guilty by association. The Ibadan battalion was the most undisciplined and violent in the history of Nigeria's army. Now, some of the people that were plotting the coup in January, that plotted the coup in January, escaped because they were in prisons that were inaccessible to the soldiers. But those that were in prisons that were accessible to the soldiers, they met horrible, grisly fates that we're not going to discuss. Now, a final order was given to the Ibadan barracks that everybody should return to their state of origin, but they did not answer, or they did not respond to that until a lieutenant colonel came onto the property of barracks and told them that they all had to go, but they should take their weapons and ammunition and ensure that there is no weapon in the armory that is operable. And if they were attacked or mistreated on their way, they should, if necessary, advance south shooting anything in their sights. A few Yoruba officers unfortunately also participated in the coup because they were aggrieved by the death of their leader, Chief Akitola. Now, some Yoruba soldiers were actually imprisoned, but they were released because of their distinctive tribal marks. Now, several Yoruba soldiers were also offed because it is very difficult to differentiate between an Easterner and a Westerner in some situations. And those of you that sit on your asses on Twitter, pardon my language, those of you that sit on your Twitter thumbs and tweeting and fueling the flames of tribalism because you think you are protected by some imaginary protection. Soldiers were also afraid that once the Northerners finished with the Igbos, they'll be next. So as a result, they did not show up for work. Back to Kano. Remember when I said there was no immediate assaults? Because of the actions of Major James Oluleye, who locked the armory. It did nothing to reduce the tension between the Northern and Igbo soldiers. Now, we had civilian mobs who were hunting for Igbos already, and these mobs surrounded the barracks in Kano. You also have soldiers who were trying to earn their respect. Now, earn their respect by participating in the coup. Now, the colonel decided to separate the Igbo soldiers for their own safety. So they were going to transfer them to a separate location in Castina. Now, on their way to Castina, they were all offed, 10 of them, by the same northern escort that was supposed to take them to safety. Now, things did not end there. It only escalated. An incident happened in a nearby village in Kano where a district officer was missing and the police needed a military escort. These were soldiers that wanted to earn their respect. They were also given live ammunition. On October 1st, 1966, these soldiers opened fire on the parade ground while they were being addressed by their commanding officer, offing their own northern soldiers in the process. They had lost complete control. Though the commanding officer was able to escape, Igbo civilians in the village were not spared. At the Kano airport, the soldiers saw a crowd of Igbo refugees who were trying to board a southbound flight. They offed everybody. They even went into the plane cabin, dragged out people, offed them. Igbo workers at the airport were not spared. Sometimes they would go into the terminal as well. The soldiers also went to the railway and offed Igbo civilians that were trying to board a train home. Many travelers and refugees, all Igbos, were offed. The massacre on October 1st, 1966, which was Nigeria's 6th independence anniversary, was the worst of the whole mutiny. These firearm-wielding soldiers contributed immensely to the rate of killing and assault that happened that day. The soldiers and the civilian mob offed hundreds of Igbo civilians that day in Kano, and it was beyond the control of the police. When the military governor of the Northern region got there, Lieutenant Colonel Castina, he traveled to Kano to confront the mutineers bravely, but what he narrated was frightening. I'll put up his comments on the screen, and if you want to read it, pause this video. He, however, managed to put down the mutiny by driving street to street for hours with the Emir of Kano. The sight and authority of the Emir of Kano shamed the looters and the soldiers from continuing their actions, if I would say. The battalion was the only army in the unit to be reprimanded for their actions in immunity, and it was because it was the only unit to off their fellow northern soldiers. Not because of the civilians that were off, not because of the soldiers, the Igbo soldiers that were offed, but because they offed their fellow northern soldiers was the reason why they were reprimanded. The units was disbanded. Injured Igbo refugees returned to the east to tell their stories. There were reprisal attacks on northerners in the east. Amidst all of this craziness and tension, in Enugu, Lieutenant Colonel David Ogbuehi was able to get northern and eastern soldiers to toast, take pictures before the northern soldiers departed for their states of origin. Ojukwu himself felt a burden of responsibility and guilt because he had informed Igbos to return to the northern region after the May 1996 riot. This was the riot that happened after the unification decree that Aburi announced. He eventually ordered all non-Easterners to leave the East for their safety. He wanted to prevent a conflict between the Igbos and particularly Yoruba residents because the Igbos felt like their Yoruba neighbors in the north did not do enough to protect them from the rampaging northern killers. All of this that I have narrated happened before the Aburi Accords in Ghana and before the Civil War in 1967. Why were we not taught in school this story? What happened to our history classes? A lot of us, maybe a lot of Easterners know these stories, which I would assume that they know, but a lot of Westerners do not know about this story. I myself left out a lot of details because of how graphic some of the often were. So maybe for that reason, it might not be taught in its entirety. But we deserve to know. Silly people on Twitter constantly saying nonsense about tribalism and constantly fueling the flames of tribalism need to know. One of the reasons why I decided to talk about this was because I'm one of those people that like to argue. And I remember I had an argument with a friend back in one of the first places I used to work. His name is Emeka. And I remember that we had an argument about the Civil War and all of that. And I remember how passionate and angry he was about my ignorance on my side of the story, you know, when I used to argue about, who is more tribalistic, da 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 da. And I remember how he was very passionate. I remember how I felt when he was telling me his own side of the argument. But I just felt like he was taking things to his chest too much. Things were too, it was too heavy. Like it was just being dramatic. That's how I thought it was. And I want to apologize to him about how I must have made him feel or made him felt in that conversation. Anyways, I will stop there. Which of these did you know in school? Which of these did you learn about? As a Yoruba person, do you know about this story? And as an Igbo person, what do you know about the story? What have I left out? What is incorrect? I hope that this video goes a long way in changing the narratives that you have about people and giving them the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes understanding the pain of people when they explain their own side of the story. And maybe to change your views about tribalism as a whole in Nigeria. If you did not know this story before today and you have been tribalistic in the past, I hope that you are able to take a step back and reevaluate the things that you know, the things that you have learned. But if you know about all of these things in detail and you are still tribalistic, I don't know how I can help you. You are beyond help at this point. Anyways, thank you so much for coming to this episode. We'll take a pause on the political conversations and move on to other light conversations. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.